Hey guys, how's it going? It must have been lag here, and today I'd like to talk about something I'm super interested in. It combines creativity, video games, technology, and that's frames per second. And in particular, I'm going to correlate it to the PlayStation 5 news, where many of the exclusives are targeting 30 FPS. Where we're trying to reach higher FPSs, it's debatable. It generally is what's preferred, although some people go graphics. But first, let's learn what FPS is. FPS stands for frames per second. And what that means is how many pictures are done per second to create what is film. Now in 30 FPS, that obviously means there's 30 pictures in a second to create the film. 60 FPS, 60 frames, which means twice the smoothness as this video's done in 60 FPS. Starting at the beginning, silent films were done 16 to 24 frames per second, which as you could tell was very choppy. If you ever look and you wonder why it looks so stuttery as you're seeing those movies, it's because there was so few frames put in per second. Then we get into animation, which is obviously my favorite, stuff like Tom and Jerry, Looney Tunes. It was usually shot on twos, is what they would call it. So it was 24 frames per second, but they would use one drawing per frame, so that would be 12 pictures per second. And that's what gives you that old classic cartoon look. Now when you get into the modern day movies and TVs, it kind of varies. When they go for a more cinematic look, you're looking around 24, 30 frames per second. And a lot of the current modern sitcoms and everything are doing 60 frames per second to give a more lifelike appearance. There is artistry involved in the choice. It's not just higher frame rates are better, except for when you're gaming. In particular, first-person shooters. When you're making first-person shooters, you want to crank that FPS as high as you can. Frames do win games. If you check out Linus Tech Tips, he even did a video on how frames win games. The higher response rate does make a difference in acquisition and just seeing how everything goes across the screen. That being said, games like The Last of Us, which is not a first-person shooter and it's done much more in a cinematic way, definitely looks great as 30 frames per second. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Looking at this article by Chandler Wood from PlayStationLifestyle.net, we see, this generation of consoles has been filled with endless whining about frame rates and resolution. Many thought the debates over performance versus visual fidelity would end with the power of next-gen consoles enabling wider adoption of 4K 60 FPS as a base, but that doesn't seem to be the case. However, Richard Ledbetter, one of the most knowledgeable tech reporters over at Eurogamer's Digital Foundry, Ledbetter notes that many of Sony's own first-party PS5 games are targeting 30 frames per second, including Horizon Forbidden West, Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, and Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales. This, of course, is very different from Xbox Series X, which has Microsoft talking about a 60 FPS standard. With roughly double the compute power of the Xbox One X, Microsoft can certainly deliver on that target, but Ledbetter calls out the obvious here. The basic maths is pretty straightforward. If you deliver twice the power of existing console hardware, doubling frame rate effectively sucks up most of that extra throughput, meaning that there's little left over to push graphical fidelity in other areas. So that's what we're getting at here. FPS makes for better gameplay, no questions asked. But when you have a console, you have a set number of resources able to be divvied out to whatever you want. If you're going to increase the frame rate, you're not going to be able to increase the graphics as much. Now, which one do we care about? If you're a hardcore gamer, if you're a competitive first-person shooter, you know frames win games. You'd rather play at 1080p, 240 Hz versus 4K at 30 frames per second. But who are buying these consoles? You know, it's the casual people where graphics are more important. And I actually don't mind myself. I like to divvy. I like to do competitive multiplayer, but I like my single-player games as well. And while Last of Us 2 had an interesting story, you cannot argue those graphics. And the 30 frames per second did add a cinematic quality to the game, which I did appreciate. If you're going to be out there playing MOBAs, you definitely want high frame rates. If you're going to be out there playing Call of Duty competitively, Halo, anything like that, you want those high frame rates. But what about God of War? What about Horizon Zero Dawn? These are not competitive games. These are games that are immersive, where you live in the world. I wouldn't mind the 60 frames per second, but if you're telling me they could use those utilizations better elsewhere to make a higher quality world to live in, then I am all for that. We gotta remember, these are $500 consoles. The people not used to PCs don't know where to go from here hardware spec-wise, but if these things are gonna be $500, that is barely an entry-level computer. The fact that they're doing mass production allows them to sell these components at cheaper prices, thus the $500 PlayStation 5, if it's $500, is definitely an equivalent to a $900 PC, which is absolutely amazing. I mean, we're running NVIDIA architecture, RDNA 2.0, Zen 2, so cool. We're looking at computers these days, but still, it's around the $500 budget. You can't expect much. So would you rather higher frames but the same quality graphics that you saw on the PlayStation 4? Or would you rather better looking graphics with the frame rates you're used to? If you want to play competitive, maybe buy a PC? Looking at the article a little further, it seems like Spider-Man is the perfect example of what to go with. Now for Miles Morales, it's going to stay at the 30 frames per second. Why? Because they're adding all kinds of things like dynamic weather and lighting, things that would not be capable if you just bumped it to a 60 frames per second game. It's about compromise. It's about what's more important. So when talking about frame rates, you also have to talk about hertz, which is essentially the same thing. When you buy a TV, they usually come in 60 hertz, or you could buy 120 hertz. That means that the screen refreshes that many times per second. So if you had a game that you could get at 120 frames per second, but your screen only does 60 hertz, you're going to get 60 refreshes. So it really comes down to the lowest common denominator for these things. And for that, again, it's about resources and allotting certain percentages to what's going to happen. So 4K is 4 times the resolution of 1080. So if you're playing on a 1080 screen, you have a lot of real estate in that power to divvy out. What I'd like to see is a lot of these PlayStation exclusives. Okay, 4K at 30 FPS, but show me 1080 at a locked 60. Locked 60. That should be more than capable, and I really hope they do that. It would be nice to see them do something like that. As we move forward in the tech world and the gaming world, it's about options and customization and being catered to you. You want to get a nice big 60-inch 4K TV and play that Spider-Man at 30 frames per second looking like a visual feast? Sure. You want to sit down at your desk with your 27-inch 1080p 120 hertz monitor and being able to rock that? Why not? Why not take the extra step to ensure everybody who plays the game is playing the best possible version they can for what they want to do? One game I used to be a diehard fan of, still play occasionally, is Destiny. I wanted to bring that up because I want you guys to see the difference when you buy the new console. They are saying Destiny is moving to 60 frames per second with the new gen consoles. I really want you to check it out because it's going to be free to play. Going from Destiny at 30 FPS to Destiny at 60 FPS, it's like playing a brand new game. I could speak on it, but you're not going to see it until you try it yourself. If you have not played on PC, you've been playing Destiny 1 and Destiny 2 at 30 FPS, you don't know any better. When it's running at twice the frame rate, let alone higher if you're playing on PC, I'm rocking about 160 hertz myself, it is so buttery, so crispy, clean, smooth. You can't describe the experience until you play it yourself. FPSs, as in first-person shooters, are particularly where frames per second shine because it's such a reactionary, twitchy thing you do as you're scanning the screen constantly, trying to see what's moving, doing a 360 quick no-scope, noob ponage snipe shot. It's all about seeing where they are. Now, if you're seeing this person run across the screen, it's the same time. First-person shooter, perfect example. Let's say you're seeing somebody cross the doorway, go into another door. It's a 2-second window. Now you're seeing 2 seconds, whether you're playing 30, 50, 60, 120, 250 frames per second. But at 30 frames per second, you are seeing 60 pictures of that guy. Now your brain is processing 60 pictures, less information, less to go off of, versus 60 frames per second, you're seeing 120 pictures of that gentleman about to take a bullet to the dome piece. And it's just, it works with your brain better. It's just a smoother acquisition and, you know, bullet time and following, and bam, he's shot. You see better targeting. Now, I don't want anybody to get butthurt. If you are getting an 8.0 KD on Call of Duty with your 30 FPS basic Xbox One with a 720, not even true HD screen, you're a monster. You deserve the credit. You're better than me, that's for sure, because, you know, I got the 4K, 120 hertz and all that stuff and everything, and, you know, I barely stick to 1 KD. I am not talking down. If you are a good FPS player without refresh rate, you're a monster, and you should give yourself a round of applause. We are not here to talk down on that. It's just that there is no argue that you will do better with higher refresh rates. So I wanted to go over all that and see what you guys think. You know, you have Xbox touting the 60 FPS standard, which there's nothing wrong with. And you have PlayStation, where many of their console exclusives, they're targeting 30 FPS, but these aren't multiplayer games. These are storytelling, single world, beautiful graphic-driven games where I think 30 FPS is perfectly fine. If you're going to show me that you put that horsepower into something else, I'm totally cool with it. Let me know what you guys think. Are you still okay with 30 FPS? Does it have to be 60 FPS? Flat baseline across the board for every system? What's going on? This is It Must Have Been Lag. Please comment, like, share, subscribe, join, follow, whatever it is you do that would make me so happy. I'd super appreciate it. You guys have a good one. Bye.